Which leadership principles does Amazon test the most in these jobs interviews? And I believe that what you're actually interested in, which ones you should prepare, which one gets you the best value for the time invested into this process. So I thought of giving you a little algorithm on a couple of points you'd want to consider here. Let's start first with the least tested leadership principles in Amazon interviews, and those would be, in my experience, hire and develop the best, which only get asked for pretty senior to manager level roles in general, and also frugality. So the frugality is also not very asked for rather junior roles. So this would be, the two that you could eventually skip if you don't fall into any of these categories. What's the most asked leadership principle in Amazon interviews? I believe this should come as little to no surprise. That's actually under customer obsession, because customer obsession is there. It's the most important principle there. What's the most interesting leadership principle? That let's say what's the most ambiguous leadership principle, if you want, from those 14 leadership principles. This would be I write a lot, and I would very much suggest you to really get a handle of it and really think about it thoroughly, because usually when you get used with the most complex of these principles, that's where you have the tendency to become significantly better overall with these behavioral interviewing skills. Now, which leadership principle would be the most relevant for your role? This is also another way that you could find the one that brings you the best bang for the buck, if you want. For example, for a senior SDE, I've often noticed that they test you on invent and simplify quite often. Or on a junior SDE, they test you for the ownership principle. Or for a PM role, they might very well test you on deliver results. So think of it, what's the most relevant leadership principle that you believe makes sense for your role? And this is also one that you'll likely get asked questions about. And last but not least, think of what's the principle that you connect the best with from those 14 leadership principles. And I know the question was which one Amazon's asked the most in job interviews, but the reason why you'd really want to take this question seriously, which one you connect with the best, is because that's usually your strength. And in a job interview, you must sell yourself on your strength. So if you have that one principle that you're really good at, even if a question is not, even if you're not convinced that the question is not necessarily linked with that principle, but you have that amazing story that's actually your strength, you have a very, very high probability to do well in a job interview. So this would be a couple of these pointers you want to keep in mind. Well, which are the most commonly asked Amazon principles in job interviews. And remember here, I'm primarily speaking about the Amazon on-site interview, because even if you're gonna get tested on some leadership principles on the telephone screening rounds, the on-site is the place where the difference is actually made by you preparing on the principles or not. And for the on-site, it's more often than not that they will test you on 2 leadership principles in each now virtual interviewing round. So in my opinion, this question does actually make sense, also because Amazon does apparently have leadership principles that they'd like to highlight. They'd like to put an emphasis on while differentiating between job interview candidates. So this is another reason why I definitely believe that this question makes sense. Now, of course, some of you will take this in order to skip preparing for others, which I don't believe it's a really good idea, simply because, as I just said, if you have 5 interviewing rounds, 5 times 2 leadership principles per round, you will get tested on at least 10 of these leadership principles. So this is, these are a couple of pointers. And by the way, you might get asked 1 to 2 questions for each of these principles, depending, how well it goes, and depending how many follow-up questions you will receive with these. But overall, which are, I believe, I hope I gave you an interesting perspective here over what are the least asked, what are the most asked, what are the interesting leadership principles, what could be the most relevant for the job that you're applying for, and what's your strength. So this would be a couple of the pointers you want to keep in mind with respect to most used leadership principles in Amazon interviews.